Today's scripture reading brings us to 1 Samuel chapter 31. This is it. This is the final chapter in the book of 1 Samuel. Begins with the last of the judges and ends with the death of the first king, going again from theocracy to a monarchy. And I have this chapter broken down simply into two parts. The first is verses 1 through 7, and that is the Deaths of Saul and Jonathan. Now, unfortunately, as we see in verse number 2, the battle's been set up for 2 chapters now. The 2 chapters ago, they had set themselves in array, the Philistines and the Israelites, near each other. That's when Saul went and looked and saw the Philistines and went and talked to the witch. And then in the next chapter, chapter 30, is kind of a parenthetical thought in that David left from the Philistines, and it tells what happened when he left, and that was that he went and saw there at Ziklag how the Amalekites had come and ransacked it, and chapter 30 tells of how he went and got all of the women folk and the children and stuff back and avenged their burning of Ziklag, which was their home base in the Philistines. So it jumps back to the narrative with Saul, and the battle starts. The Philistines fight against Israel, and Israel is routed. They start fleeing, and through the chaos of battle, an arrow had hit Saul. And but before we see that in verse number 2 that Jonathan died. And that's tragic. It's tragic because Jonathan was a good man, and he was a wonderful friend unto David, treated him with kindness, and was just really, as good a friend as you could be to someone. That's what Jonathan was to David. But unfortunately, Jonathan died. The reason Jonathan died was he was still with Saul. That's why. That's why Jonathan died. This was his dad, and I understand that, but I believe this is an instance of one that went along with the family instead of going along with God. You see, because Jonathan knew that David was going to be king, and Jonathan said, "I'll be your right-hand man." Jonathan expected to be that, but instead of just going ahead and leaving his father like David's brethren did and went down there and hid out in the cave and then have been going around for years now. Instead of Jonathan doing it, Jonathan stayed at the palace with his daddy. And so that's why Jonathan died. It's tragic, but that's the reason. Saul is wounded in battle. He takes an arrow that an archer had shot, and he was wounded, and he asked his armor bearer to kill him. His armor bearer would not do it. So Saul kills himself. He falls upon his sword and he dies. And then when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he killed himself. And that's kind of where it ends. You see there in verse number 7, when the men of Israel on the other side of the valley, and then they that were on the other side of Jordan, they saw. Then all of them fled. They left their territory, and the Philistines just ransacked it all. They took ground of that which God had given the children of Israel. They lost it because of Saul dying and, just all of the calamity with Saul as a king. Now, that's the first thing. Second portion of this is found in verses 8 through the remainder of the chapter. And verses 8 through the end of the chapter, I have that titled The Humiliating Ending Revealed. Talking about the ending of the book, because it's really just a humiliating ending for the children of God to suffer. But of course, there's reason for that. Saul and his sons, the next day, it says on the morrow there in verse number 8, the Philistines come and they find Saul. They find his sons. They strip him bare, and they cut Saul's head off, And they put his body up and paraded around for everyone to see, every one of the Philistines. Look what I had. And they took his armor and he put it in the house of Ashtaroth. The house of Ashtaroth was, of course, a false god. And so you have the king of God's people, his armor sitting in the house of a false god. My, what reason it gave for the enemies of God to rejoice. Man, it should never have been. Ashtaroth is exalted because of all of this. But you understand, go back to why this is where it's at. The reason why is because the children of Israel wanted to be just like everybody else. They wanted a king. They didn't want God to be their king anymore. They wanted a king like everybody else had. You can trace it all the way back to there. That's where it had. And then God gave them a king after their own imaginations in Saul, who looked the part on the outside, but on the inside was a dog. They got what they wanted. And this is the results. A humiliating end. So will be for every Christian. For every Christian that desires to be like everybody else. Their life will be shipwrecked. And it will not be a glorious end for the child of God, but it will be a humiliating end for them as well. So that's going to be the book of 1 Samuel and the last chapter, chapter 31 of the book of 1 Samuel. Like I said, it ends on a very sour note, but it's to be expected. Prayerfully, we'll see better things to come in 2 Samuel. So that'll do it for this, and I hope it's been a blessing unto you. And God bless, and Lord willing, we'll see you soon.